Do you believe that legends are just scary stories? What if I told you that a group of friends discovered, in the worst possible way, that not everything is a myth? Today, you will learn the terrifying story of the Midnight Ghost Train, a story that will stir your deepest fears and make you question what is real. Get ready for a journey that can change the way you see the unknown. But be careful. Not everyone who goes on it comes back to tell the story. Title of the first story, The Midnight Ghost Train. It was a small, forgotten town in the countryside, surrounded by dense forests and a railway line that was no longer good for anything other than gathering dust and rust. The older residents avoided talking about that abandoned stretch, but in whispers, everyone knew the story. The legend of the ghost train. They said that it appeared at midnight sharp, running along the rusty tracks of a disused station. Its whistle echoed like a distant lament, and the black smoke it released seemed to engulf everything around it. Anyone who dared to see it, or worse, enter it, never returned the same. The rumor had always been treated as a tale to scare children, until a group of local workers, young, curious and bored, decided to challenge the legend. Among them were Marcos, the ever-fearless leader, Claudio, the skeptic who loved to deny stories, and Jonas, the quietist, but who felt increasingly uncomfortable with the idea. It all started one night at the local bar, when, after a few beers, an elderly man known as Seu Raimundo decided to tell the story in detail that none of them had heard before. "You think this is a joke, don't you?" Raimundo began, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "I've seen this train with my own eyes, and I'll tell you one thing, you don't want to be there when it appears. Hey, before we continue with the video, just make sure you're already subscribed to the channel, because here we're going to bring you a series of videos like this one, with incredible, terrifying stories for you. We're going to continue." The laughter was immediate. Marcos scoffed. "A train that appears out of nowhere? Stop being so silly, Raimundo. You're already making up a story so we can buy another round." Raimundo looked seriously with tears in his eyes. "My brother got on that train. That was 40 years ago. He never came back." The silence that followed was piercing. Claudio tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced. Jonas looked away to the ground, feeling an inexplicable shiver run down his spine. Driven by a mixture of skepticism and adrenaline, the three decided that they would go to the old deactivated station that very night. If the ghost train was real, they wanted to see it with their own eyes. If it was just an invention, they would have another story to laugh about at the bar the next day. As midnight approached, the three grabbed flashlights and walked along the rusty tracks that led to the station. The moon was high in the sky, but the trees seemed to create a dome of darkness around them. The silence was so profound that the sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed like a drumbeat. When they arrived at the station, the sight was desolate. The building was falling apart, with broken windows and the paint on the walls peeling with age. The wind blew through the cracks, making a sound that sounded like a whisper. As they waited, Claudio laughed. "Look, no smoke, no train. That's just another story to scare silly people." But before he could finish his sentence, a sound cut through the air. A whistle, long, distant but unmistakable. Marcos looked at the others. "Did you hear that?" Jonas nodded, his face pale. The whistle sounded again, closer this time, and then something began to appear on the horizon. A faint light, like that of a lighthouse, swaying in the distance. It was impossible. That line hadn't been used for decades, but still, there it was. The train. The brightness of the headlight grew with each passing second, wavering as if the very air around it was distorted. The sound of the whistle, once distant, was now deafening, echoing along the rusty tracks and cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. The three friends stood still, their eyes fixed on the direction of that impossible vision. Marcos, the most confident of the group, tried to speak. but his voice came out as a whisper. This can't be real. The train appeared like a colossal figure, emerging from the shadows of the forest. It was unlike any train they had ever seen. Old locomotives had a nostalgic air, but this one seemed like something out of a nightmare. It was all black, with a finish so shiny that it reflected the moonlight as if it were made of glass. The smoke coming out of the chimney was thick and dark, but it didn't rise into the sky. It spread across the floor like a cloak, wrapping around the tracks and reaching the feet of the three friends. This is some kind of prank, right? Claudio stammered, trying to maintain a skeptical stance, but the trembling in his voice betrayed him. Jonas, who had not said anything until then, took a step back. His face was pale, and his wide eyes stared at the train that was now slowly stopping at the station. The metal wheels seemed to creak like a muffled scream, and the sound reverberated in each of their chests. When the train finally stopped, a door opened with a metallic creak. Inside, everything was darkness. There were no internal lights, no signs of passengers, but there was something, a sensation, a presence that seemed to pull the three friends closer, as if the air around them was being sucked into those dark entrails. "Is anyone seeing this?" Marcos asked, his usual courage beginning to crumble. At that moment, a figure appeared at the open door of the train. It was a man, or at least it seemed to be. He wore an old conductor's uniform, but his face was covered in a shadow that not even the light of the headlight could illuminate. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, and he raised a bony hand, pointing directly at the three. "Ticket?" The driver's voice echoed, low and hoarse, but piercing enough to make Jonas's skin crawl. Claudio laughed nervously, trying to hide his fear. "Look, someone hired an actor to scare us. Nice try, but it won't work." But the moment he took a step forward, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shake, and he stopped immediately. The conductor tilted his head, as if he were observing each of them, and then repeated the word. "Ticket?" Marcos took a step back. "Let's go. This isn't normal. We shouldn't be here." Jonas remained still, as if in a trance. He felt something strange, something that seemed to be pulling him toward the train. It was as if an invisible force was messing with his mind, whispering things he couldn't understand, but that awakened a primitive fear. Suddenly, the smoke around him began to rise, covering his ankles and enveloping the entire station in a dense fog. The train let out another whistle, so loud that it made the three of them cover their ears. The figure of the conductor took a step back, disappearing into the darkness of the carriage, while the door remained open, like a silent invitation. "We have to go! Now!" Marcos shouted, pulling Jonas by the arm. But as they slowly walked away, the feeling of being watched did not disappear. The train light began to flicker, and the sound of distant voices like whispers coming from hell itself filled the air. They didn't know it, but that night would be marked forever. So, have you ever heard of scary story on a train? Leave in the comments what you know about it, and if you believe in these stories. Continuing. As the three friends retreated, the atmosphere around them seemed to change. The air was denser, almost suffocating, and every sound seemed muffled, as if the world beyond the station had disappeared. However, even with the desire to escape, there was something inexplicable that kept them there, as if they were puppets tied by invisible strings. Jonas, who until then had been the quietest, stopped abruptly and let go of Marcos's arm. His gaze was fixed on the train. He took a step forward, as if guided by a force the others could not comprehend. "Jonas, what are you doing?" Marcos asked, trying to pull him back, but Jonas did not answer. Instead, he pointed to the open door of the train. "Can't you hear?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Someone is calling for me." Claudio's eyes widened, and he shook his head in denial. "No one's calling you, man. This is all in your head. Let's go before something worse happens." Marcos looked around, trying to find some logical explanation for what was happening. But there was none. Everything in that station seemed like something out of a nightmare. The train, the smoke, the oppressive silence. And now Jonas seemed to be completely hypnotized. It was then that the conductor's voice echoed again, this time louder and closer. Passage. The word reverberated in the air like thunder, making Marcos's heart race. Claudio, always the skeptic, took a step back, but ended up tripping and falling to the ground. He cursed, but quickly got up, rubbing his hands on his jeans. "This isn't real. This can't be real," he shouted, as if trying to convince himself. Suddenly, the train's headlights went out completely, plunging the station into almost total darkness. Only the open door shone with a pale glow, as if inviting them in. And then, from the depths of the carriage, a strange sound emerged. A low, melancholy music, like an old song played on a gramophone. Jonas took another step toward the door, and his expression was empty, as if he were no longer himself. I need to get in. They're waiting for me," he murmured. "Who's waiting for you?" Marcos asked, desperate. "Jonas, there's no one in there. This is a trap." But Jonas didn't seem to hear. He climbed the first step of the train, and the music got louder. Claudio, now terrified, grabbed Marcos by the arm. "Let's get out of here." "Does he want to go? Let him go alone. There's nothing we can do." Marcos hesitated. He wanted to save his friend, but fear was embedded in his chest like an icy blade. Then, something unexpected happened. From the smoke around them, faces began to emerge, as if the mist were alive. They were pale, deformed, with empty eyes that watched the three with an insatiable hunger. "Come on, Marcos. Now!" Claudio shouted, pulling him hard. Claudio's shout seemed to break the trance. For a moment, Marcos looked at Jonas, who was about to enter the carriage, and shouted, "Jonas, don't do that!" Jonas stopped and slowly turned around. For a moment, his eyes seemed to return to normal, but then a hand reached out from the darkness of the carriage and grabbed his arm, pulling him forcefully inside. The door closed with a bang, and the train let out a deafening whistle. Marcos and Claudio, terrified, ran as fast as they could towards the track that led back to the city. Behind them, the sound of the train seemed to chase them, as if the wheels themselves were moving across the earth towards them. The darkness enveloped them, and the feeling of being watched did not disappear. As they ran, the last sound they heard was the whistle of the train moving away, but now accompanied by a sinister laugh that echoed through the forest. Marcos and Claudio continued running, panting, their footsteps echoing along the dirt track. The forest around them seemed to grow narrower, the trees casting shadows that moved as if they were alive. The dry branches crackled beneath their feet, and the feeling of being followed was almost unbearable. Marcos tried to look back, but Claudio grabbed him by the arm. "Don't look! Just keep running!" he shouted, his voice shaking with pure panic. Finally, they saw a clearing ahead, where the moonlight illuminated the ground. There, they stopped to catch their breath, bent over, hands on their knees, breathing as if they had been running for hours. The silence that surrounded them was so profound that even the sound of their breathing seemed deafening. "What was that?" Claudio asked, his voice cracking. "What was on that train?" Marcos shook his head, unable to answer. He was still trying to process what had happened. The image of Jonas being pulled into the train wouldn't leave his mind. There was something in those hands, something inhuman. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed in the distance. It was the train's whistle. But this time, it sounded different. It wasn't just a mechanical sound. There was something about it that sounded almost like a scream, a disturbing mix that made his hair stand on end. "He's still out there," Marcos said, swallowing hard. Claudio took a few steps back, looking at the trees around him. "We need to get out of here. We can't stay here for another minute." Marcos nodded, but something stopped him from moving. He realized they weren't alone. The shadows around the clearing were darker than they should have been, and then he saw faces began to appear between the trees. They were pale, with empty eyes, the same ones he had seen at the station. "They followed us," Marcos whispered. Claudio turned to see what he was looking at and froze. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, moving slowly but relentlessly, as if they knew they didn't need to run to catch up with them. "This can't be happening!" Claudio shouted, grabbing Marcos by the arm. "We have to go, now!" Before they could react, the sound of the train echoed again, but this time it was closer. It was as if the wheels were tearing the ground, and the glow of the headlight began to illuminate the clearing. Only there were no tracks, there was no road. The train simply emerged from the darkness, floating in the mist like a ghost. The door of the carriage opened with a bang, and inside they saw Jonas. He was sitting, but he no longer looked the same. His eyes were dull, his skin pale as a corpse. He slowly turned his head toward his friends and opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Marcos tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He was frozen in terror. Claudio, in a panic, pulled Marcos hard, and the two of them started running again, leaving behind the glow of the train and the faces of the figures watching them. As they ran, the train whistle echoed behind them, louder and more threatening with each passing moment. And then everything went silent again. The forest seemed dead, and the sound of their footsteps was the only noise that filled the emptiness. When they finally left the forest and saw the city lights, in the distance, they fell to the ground, exhausted and in shock. But one thing was certain, that silence did not mean they were safe. Well, we are already unraveling more and more of this story, but before I continue, I realize that you still haven't liked this video, which is very important for YouTube to help promote our content. So please like this video, which is free, okay? Let's move on. Marcos and Claudio escaped, but they were never the same. That night, when they returned to the city, they both promised never to set foot in that station again, or even mention the ghost train. However, something changed. Every night, without exception, Marcos heard a distant whistle, as if the train was still calling him. Claudio began to have recurring nightmares where he was inside the train car, surrounded by the pale faces they had found in the forest. The most disturbing part? Days later, when they finally found the courage to return to the station with the police, it was empty. There were no tracks, no train, just silence. It was as if the station had never existed. But what about Jonas? What really happened to him inside that carriage? And why did the train seem so focused on Marcos and Claudio? Could they be next? And you? Have you ever stopped to think about the secrets that seemingly forgotten places can hide? Did the ghost train really disappear, or is it just waiting for its next trip? Let us know in the comments what you think happened to Jonas, and if you would dare to visit an abandoned station at night. And stay tuned. Who knows, in the next video, you might discover more scary secrets hidden by time. Would you board this train? Title of the second story: The Last Passenger on the Night Train. In a small town forgotten by time, people still whispered about an old story, the legend of the night train. They said it appeared on the darkest nights, when the fog covered the tracks like a veil of mystery. No one knew for sure where he came from or where he was going, but those who saw him, they swore it was different. It was no ordinary train. Its carriages had a dull sheen, as if they carried decades of dust and untold stories. Some said it was made of black iron, with fogged windows that seemed to hide silent gazes. Others claimed the lights from its lanterns were watchful eyes, searching for something or someone. Legend had it that the train did not stop by chance. It only appeared for those who carried a secret, a guilt or a burden they needed to face. Locals avoided the deactivated railway at night. It was as if the air around it was colder, carrying a heavy silence that made the skin crawl. An elderly woman, Donna Maria, was the most vocal on the subject. She said that in her youth she had seen the train with her own eyes. "It is not of this world," she would say, her voice trembling. "If it stops for you, there is no going back." The story gained strength as the years went by. Young people dared each other to walk along the tracks at midnight, but none of them had the courage to go very far. It was always the same excuse. The wind was strange, or I heard footsteps behind me. But deep down, everyone was afraid of finding the train, and it was in this scenario of fear and mystery that Carlos's story began. A skeptical, practical man who didn't believe in legends until the night he heard the distant sound of a whistle. It wasn't just any sound. It was a call, and he knew it was for him. The first apparition, Carlos, was a man from the big city, accustomed to the noise of cars and the constant movement of the streets. He wasn't impressed by ghost stories or local legends. In fact, he always laughed at the superstitions that the residents of small towns carried with them. When he decided to visit his family's old town to settle inheritance issues, he never imagined that he would be the protagonist of one of those stories he despised so much. That night, the silence of the city seemed unusual, almost suffocating. He was sitting on the porch of the old house he had inherited, looking at the horizon. Everything was shrouded in thick fog, and the tracks of the disused railroad were lost in the darkness. He had heard about the night train during the day, in whispered conversations at the local bakery, but he shrugged it off. To him, it was just a figment of the locals' overactive imagination. Then he heard it. First, a faint hiss, like the sound of metal being dragged in the distance. Then, a whistle. It wasn't the whistle of a modern train, but something deeper, more ancient, as if it had come from another time. Carlos stood up, frowning. He knew the railroad had been out of use for decades. There shouldn't be any trains around here. Intrigued, and with his heart beating faster, he decided to check it out. He grabbed a flashlight and followed the old dirt path that led to the tracks. The night seemed colder as he got closer, and the sound of the whistle became clearer. It was a sound that seemed to echo, not only in his ears, but also vibrate in his mind, as if the train were calling him. When he reached the tracks, Carlos stopped abruptly. The fog was thicker there, almost impossible to pierce with his eyes. And then he saw it. Two headlights shone in the darkness, slowly approaching, but something was wrong. The headlights seemed more alive than mechanical, like two eyes watching him with an intent he couldn't decipher. Carlos stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The train was exactly as described in the stories. Old carriages, fogged, windows, and an air that exuded decades of mystery. The sound of its tracks seemed heavy, as if it carried the weight of many souls. The train slowly stopped in front of him, but no one got out. The door of one of the carriages opened, like a silent invitation, and there, standing on the tracks, Carlos felt something he had never felt before, a deep, visceral fear that seemed to grip his chest like an invisible claw. He knew he had a choice to make: get on the train or run away. But run away from what? The whistle sounded again, this time louder, almost like a command. What Carlos didn't know was that once the train had chosen him, there was no escape. Carlos found himself unable to look away from the open door of the train. The night seemed suspended in time, as if the entire world was waiting for his decision. He took a hesitant step toward the tracks, and something in the air changed. A chill ran down his spine, and the sound of the crickets stopped, leaving the room in an unearthly silence. When his feet touched the tracks, he felt an intense chill, as if he had crossed an invisible portal. The door of the carriage seemed to beckon him, although no sound came from it. He took a deep breath, trying to dispel his fear, and climbed the rusty steps. As soon as he entered, the door closed with a dull thud, making him jump in fright. Now he was inside the train. The interior was even more disturbing than he had expected. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, stained with the passage of time. The lamps flickered slightly, emitting a weak yellowish light that created dancing shadows on the sides of the seats. But what really made Carlos's blood run cold were the passengers. The seats were occupied by motionless figures, their heads slightly tilted forward. Their faces were hidden by hats, veils, or shadows that seemed to envelop their features. They did not move, did not breathe. They seemed frozen in time, like abandoned dolls in a theater of horrors. Carlos tried to ignore the suffocating presence of those figures. He walked slowly through the narrow corridor, feeling as if he was being watched at every step, even though the passengers remained still. It was then that he noticed something even more terrifying. In each window, there was no landscape outside. Instead, he saw scenes, not reflections, but vivid scenes, as if the windows were movie screens showing tragic and macabre stories. In one window, he saw a woman in a white dress screaming as she ran through a dark field. In another, a child cried alone in an empty room with a toy lying beside her. Each scene was more disturbing than the last, and Carlos began to feel the weight of those visions on his shoulders, as if they wanted to pull him inside. Little by little, he noticed a sound coming from the back of the carriage. It was a whisper, faint at first, but that soon grew until it became a collective murmur. Carlos turned quickly, but the passengers remained motionless. The sound seemed to come from all sides, surrounding him. It was as if the walls of the train were speaking to him, telling him dark secrets he didn't want to hear. When he tried to move on to the next carriage, the door in front of him opened by itself. On the other side, a new corridor awaited, even darker and more sinister. He knew that the only way to find answers, or perhaps escape this situation, was to keep moving forward. With uncertain steps, Carlos crossed to the next carriage, without, realizing that with each step he took, he was distancing himself further from the reality he knew. And the worst, the passengers behind him, still motionless, seemed to smile silently in the darkness. Carlos took a deep breath as he crossed the door to the next carriage. As soon as it closed behind him with a metallic noise, he felt there was no turning back. The atmosphere of the new carriage was even more oppressive. The lights flickered irregularly, casting shadows that seemed to move by themselves. The seats were empty, but something was wrong. On each seat, personal items were carefully arranged, as if the passengers had suddenly disappeared, leaving behind bags, hats, coats, and even still-full coffee mugs. Carlos began to walk slowly, feeling that each step made the air around him grow heavier. He noticed a book open on one of the seats, its yellow pages fluttering slightly, even though there was no wind. The cover bore a Latin phrase that he could not understand, but something about it made him feel uneasy, as if the book were watching him. Further ahead, a pocket watch was resting on another seat. Carlos picked it up, and the moment his fingers touched the cold metal, he felt dizzy. For an instant, he was no longer in the carriage, but in a narrow corridor, lit by candles, with a shadowy figure walking towards him. He blinked and returned to the train, the watch now clasped in his hand. "This is not real," he whispered to himself, trying to convince himself, but the train seemed to have its own will. When he reached the middle of the carriage, Carlos noticed something peculiar. The windows, which had previously displayed scenes of horror, were now completely covered by a dense fog. It was as if the train was moving, but to a place that did not belong to the real world. The sound of murmurs returned, but this time it was accompanied by a muffled laugh, which seemed to echo from all sides. He looked back and saw for the first time movement. In the previous carriage, where the motionless passengers were, one of the figures had changed position. Carlos froze. One of the passengers, who had previously been leaning forward, now had his head turned in his direction. He knew he could. Not go back, but the weight of that invisible gaze made the back of his neck tingle. At the end of the carriage, a door, unlike any other, awaited him. It was black, with strange symbols engraved on its surface, like ancient runes that seemed to glow faintly in the wavering light. As Carlos reached out to touch her, a soft, melancholic female voice echoed in his mind. "Why did you come? You still have time to go back?" He recoiled in fear, but he knew he had no choice. Something on that train was connected to his mother's disappearance, and he had to find out what it was. Summoning all the courage he had left, he pushed the door open with a long, deep creak. The next carriage was not like the others. This one looked like a cross between an old hall and a courtroom, with chairs lined up on both sides, all empty. In the center was a dark wooden table, and on it was an object that made Carlos's heart stop for a moment. His mother's handkerchief. He approached slowly, feeling the air around him grow colder with each step. As he picked up the handkerchief, a figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the carriage. It was a tall man, dressed in clothes that seemed to be from another era, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that partially hid his face. His eyes glowed an intense red, like live coals. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, his deep voice reverberating like thunder. Carlos froze. He was facing something much bigger than he could comprehend, but at the same time, he felt that all the answers he sought were just a step away. Well, we're already unraveling more and more of this story, but before I continue, I realized that you haven't liked this video yet. This is very important for YouTube to help promote our content. So please like this video, which is free, okay? Let's move on. As Carlos stood motionless before the shadowy figure in the carriage, something inside him changed. It was as if all the pieces of the puzzle were about to fit together. But the price for this would be higher than he imagined. The man with red eyes took a step forward, and the sound of his boots echoed like thunder. "Don't you understand, boy?" he said, his voice filled with a mixture of irony and regret. "This train doesn't take anyone home. It collects stories, and now you're part of it." Carlos felt the weight of those words, as if a cruel truth was being carved into his mind. He looked at the handkerchief in his hand and realized that it wasn't just an object left by his mother. It was a piece of her essence, a fragment of what she was, trapped in that place. But the strangest thing happened next. The man raised his hand, and the windows of the carriage lit up. Now Carlos could see flashes of stories, moments of people who, like him, had boarded the train looking for something and never returned. A young woman crying next to a suitcase, an old man holding a blood-stained letter, a child looking out with eyes full of fear. "Every choice carries a price," the man continued. "You chose to board, just like all of them. But are you willing to pay it?" In that moment, Carlos remembered all the times he had heard his mother tell stories about the train, as if she had known that one day he would end up there. And a question echoed in his mind. A question he could not ignore. Did she know this would happen? Did she choose this destination? And now a choice was before Carlos. He could leave everything behind and move forward, facing whatever it took to save what was left of his mother. Or he could give up and accept that some stories never have answers. The train seemed to come to life around him, as if it were listening to Carlos's thoughts, offering a different destination with each heartbeat. But there was something he couldn't ignore. If he got off, he would be another name in that train's book, another story lost in its dark corridors. Carlos knew the decision was in his hands, but the question that would never leave his mind was, how far would you go to save someone you love? And this is where the story leaves us, with a choice that few would have the courage to make. But what about you? What would you do? Because after all, the train never stops, and we all have stories we'd rather never tell. If you like this story and want to continue following more scary stories like this one, don't forget to leave your like. This helps us a lot to bring even more spine-chilling content. If you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any horror stories. Thank you very much for watching this far. It's a privilege to have you with us. And I'll tell you in advance, the next video will bring an even darker mystery. So, what do you think happened to Carlos? Leave your guess in the comments and we'll see you in the next story.